The name Stradivarius carries a certain magic in the violin world. It's a name we associate with perfection, with some of the greatest violinists in history, and with multi-million-dollar price tags. But how much of that reputation is actually deserved? How much ambiguity is around there? Are Strads really superior to modern violins or other older instruments? Does Stradivarius have a secret formula or technique? And why are they so expensive? Hi, and welcome back to Tone-Based Violin. I'm your host, violinist Sumina Studer, and I happen to actually work at an instrument shop where we see Stradivariuses almost daily. So today's video is getting me especially excited because the world of instruments is a vast one. I myself have been very fortunate to play on certain Stradivarius violins, both by Antonio Stradivarius as well as some of his students or his sons. I've been fortunate enough to play on an Omobono Stradivarius on loan for a few years. Just last weekend, I was playing on an Antonio Stradivarius for a concert myself. So I've been lucky enough to see these instruments up close and personal and actually play on them and experience them. So I'm going to be asking a couple of questions to Florian Leonhard, so we can ask them our burning questions about the myths of Stradivarius. Let's dive in. Let's talk about the legend himself, Antonio Stradivarius. Antonio Stradivarius was born in 1644 in Cremona in Italy, one of the great centers of violin making to this day. Antonio was trained by Niccolò Amati, who set the standard for modern violin making in the 17th century. But Stradivarius wasn't just a great student of Amati's or even a great maker, he was actually an innovator. In the instrument and music world, we differentiate Antonio Stradivarius's different phases of violin making. So there's the Amati period, which are very similar to the making style of his mentor, Niccolò Amati. This period is also called the Amatise. Then we have the long pattern era, where he made the body of the instrument a little bit longer, and he experimented with how that would impact the sound. Then we have the famous golden period of Stradivarius violins, where his best work came to shine. This was like the highlight of his career. His best instruments are from that period. And then we have the late period instruments. In his golden period from around 1700 to 1720, 1725, Stradivarius perfected the shape of his violins, the proportions of the instruments, as well as the arching, which allowed his instruments to have a certain brilliance and power that we now value very much as soloist instruments by Stradivarius. This era was also the time where he made his most famous instruments, such as the Chrysler Stradivarius, the Messiah, and the Lady Blunt, for example. These are instruments that have shaped how we think of sound and playability at the highest level. So let's dive into some of the myths, shall we? One of the most persistent myths about Stradivarius instruments is that he has some kind of secret formula to his building, whether it was in the varnish or in the wood treatment or the type of wood he used, or maybe some lost technique that luthiers to this day cannot figure out. There has been a ton of research on this. When I tell you the type of dendrochronology research that people can do these days with modern equipment, it is pretty amazing. Some studies suggest that he's used some treatments or minerals on his wood to make it a certain density, while other people claim that he was just very lucky and used wood from colder climates during that time that created denser wood. So I would like to ask this question to Florian from Florian Leonhard Fine Violins and see what he has to say on this topic. I'm so excited because we are here with Florian Leonhard, who is a dear friend of mine for many years, but also my boss, actually. He's the one person I would ask everything about Stradivarius because he is the ultimate violin expert. So thank you so much for making it work today. Welcome.
Thank you, Sumina.
We are here at the offices in London, and we have a couple questions about the Stradivarius violins, actually. How did you first get into Stradivarius violins and your interests in old Italian instruments in general?
I'll tell you a funny story. In 1982, we made an order for a book on Stradivari. This was called The Good Kind book that showed all the Stradivarius known at the time in one book. And it cost so many hundreds of German marks at the time that as a young violin maker, I couldn't quite afford to buy it. And I thought, I probably never have anything to do with Stradivarius anyway. What do I need the book for? And so funny that is that the world changed so much for me, because since I worked at Hills in the mid '80s, I was surrounded by Stradivarius and I was fascinated by them. We restored them. I had them open. I take all my notes, and it's probably the maker I know best, because the most violins around that are genuine and reference examples, and so beautifully built with such a clear handwriting that you can determine even them year by year. And it's just an incredible story.
So you are literally one of the few people on this planet that has seen Stradivarius violins not only up close, but also from the inside out. Is that correct?
Yeah, you could say that. That's very correct. I have sold dozens of them by now, but I have opened them maybe by the hundreds. So yes, we have serviced and restored and made them more beautiful, re-restored bad old restorations over the last 4 decades on a regular basis. We have always at least 3 violins open here, so it's not just once a year. It's just incredibly busy with Stradivarius and Guarneri's and Ruggeri's and all those old Cremonese violins.
Just so you know, Florian is specialized in old Italian violins, so he really knows his stuff. I have a couple questions regarding myths that we need to clear up about Stradivarius.
All right.
This is what we're here for. Let's get straight into business. Is it true that Stradivarius had a secret formula in how he built his instruments? Something about the varnish or something about his building? What do you think?
I would say, in general, the Amati family, that was the founder of that great school in Cremona, in some ways had some kind of a secret, because as long as they kept the secret within the family, there was only Amati. Everybody all over Europe ordered Amati violins, so from King Charles to the dukes in Germany or in Italy and Spain, everywhere in Britain, people everywhere ordered those famous Amati violins, until the plague arrived in the 1630s, and the Amatis needed more people to help them fulfill all the demand that was created over the previous 150 years. And from that moment on, a couple of more dynasties have been formed by Guarneri, Ruggeri, and Stradivari in some ways too. So Stradivari has probably not directly studied with Niccolò Amati, but he has had a smart brain to observe the right things, but because he probably didn't learn directly how to do things, he had to be more open and acquire the skills by trying and experimenting. And because he had a great vision and strength in what he was doing, he showed character, precision, and foresight in what to change to make a violin better. And Stradivari created an arching based on all the methods that were around that he could learn from, that worked in a more favorable way in the large halls. Mm-hmm. So I would say it was not a secret, because he learned the so-called secrets from the others because they were around. He adopted probably techniques from different makers, from Ruggeri's probably, from Niccolò Amati as well. He might have supplied him with inlay work.
They were all neighbors in Cremona back then, right? So it was a community.
It was a very small city, if you want, and even the ones that were not direct neighbors, you could reach by foot within 15 minutes. Exactly. So Stradivari, I would say, did not have a secret in that sense. He was just the strongest in his character and his execution, and he was very successful. People just wanted his violins everywhere. And while after 1700 the others suffered, Stradivari thrived incredibly.
Did Stradivarius revolutionize what fine instrument making meant?
That's an interesting question, very good one. I would say the Amatis already created that before Stradivari. But Stradivari set standards in terms of sound uh, because he found a way to create the reference sound for us that we still today follow, which makes him such a famous household name.
All right. The next myth is maybe a little bit of a controversial one. Would you say Stradivariuses always sound better than modern violins?
It's a tough one to say. Theoretically, they should be because that's what you pay for. But I would say it's not only about sound, why Stradivari is so valuable and so collectible. You can theoretically reproduce the sound of a Stradivari quite closely, but you cannot, with a modern violin, quite replace that incredible provenance history, what went into that violin, who played on it in the past, and that's a very special thing. So that's missing a little bit, and violinists and also audience love that fact that there is a history behind. But as pure tool, you can theoretically reproduce it. The trouble is, it will never be on a large scale because you have only very few makers who have access to those instruments learn to really understand them, how they worked and why they work so well, what wood to choose, which ground to choose that will last as well, because the Stradivari is already 300 years around and it still is flexible in sound, it still is brilliant, it still projects. In general, you can say Stradivarius have that reference sound that you want with the brilliance, depth, power and warmth, and each Stradivari sounds different to another one. So it's not.
So true.
Yeah, they are all not all exactly the same, but when you let yourself into them, and you're willing to do so, you can explore incredible things. As a clear answer, as a yes or no, I would say the sound of a Stradivari is in general the reference sound to all of us, players and makers alike.
Probably the biggest myth of them all, the question that we all ask ourselves is why are Stradivariuses so expensive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's actually not a myth, it's a fact. Because Stradivarius are our reference violin for us. You know, while in technology and in most things that we think of today, if something is 10 years old, it's old already. It's not so good as something that is coming out now. iPhone, computers, cars, everything is always better next year, kind of. While in our profession, the best was from 300 years ago. It's quite incredible.
Crazy. Yeah.
So we are collecting something that was the best already 300 years ago, something that we look up to, like normally into the future. So we treat these items as partly an antique, partly as a tool, partly as a collectible, partly as an investment for people as well, because it's a tangible asset that has proven itself for hundreds of years throughout crisis times, revolutions, wars, peace times, everything culturally. It just has conquered the whole world. The imagination of many people, the audience is just growing worldwide, not necessarily in percentage terms per country, but in terms of numbers. We have way more listeners today to classical music and music that is played on violins than 50 years ago or 100 years ago.
I learn something new every time I talk to Florian. Thank you so, so much.
Thank
I
you,
think the
Sumina.
very
Yeah.
last question
Yeah.
is what do we have right here in front of us?
This is a long pattern Stradivari, and it's from the very first year he invented this model. It's based on a mix of things that he could learn. He learned from Amati, he learned from probably Ruggieri, he has seen Guarneri's in his city, and he will have experienced something from Brescian makers like Gasparo da Salo and Maggini. And he definitely has applied something he has learned from outside Cremona, like from the Brescian makers like Maggini, to incorporate into his design. So he made a slightly so-called long pattern. He made a fuller arching, flatter across, not so pinched, and they project really well. And this is one of the very first violins of that period from 1690. Gorgeous violin, and works very well for musicians.
Does play pretty nicely. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
And check out Florian Leonhard Fine Violins for more expert advice. One of the first things we think of in the instrument industry is the rarity of the instrument. Stradivarius made about 1,100 instruments in total in his lifetime, many of which have been lost or destroyed. So there are about 650, I believe, left. And out of those 650 instruments, there are about 500 violins left in this world. Most of them are in museums or private collections, and some belong to foundations so that they can be played by musicians. Some private donors acquire the instruments and lend it to a soloist of their choosing. It's extremely rare to come by a Stradivarius. Only a handful go up in sale ever. Secondly, we think of historical significance. When a prominent violinist such as Heifetz or Oistrakh or Chrysler plays an instrument from Stradivarius, this makes it even more special. Because we have to remember, these aren't just instruments. These are instruments that are also artworks and pieces of history. So for the history of the instrument to have a prominent violinist to have performed on it and made the wood become alive, essentially, that really adds to the value. Third of all, there's the topic of demand. Very straightforwardly said, everybody wants Stradivarius. Collectors, musicians, investors who see the appeal of the value rising constantly. When something is rare and highly desirable, the prices skyrocket. And fourth, but certainly not last, condition of an instrument. Because when we think of instruments that are 200 plus years old, it is clear that there will be some wear and tear on them, especially because about 200 years ago, 150 years ago, even 50 years ago, the way people would handle these instruments was just not the same. So not only is there wear and tear, but there could also be some bad patch-up jobs, bad maintenance, and just simply bad handling. So for an instrument to be in tip-top condition with barely any cracks, that makes certain Stradivariuses more valuable than other Stradivariuses. One more myth that I really wanted to talk about when it comes to the playing of the Stradivarius: does it feel different and actually play differently than modern violins or other old instruments? Personally, I've had the chance to play on quite a few Strads in my lifetime as a violinist, and I think a lot of violinists who have played on Strads can agree with me when I tell you it is not necessarily very easy to play on a Stradivarius. Stradivariuses and most old instruments of high quality are extremely responsive, so they don't hide any of your mistakes in some ways. So in some ways they're unforgiving, but in a lot of other ways this means that you are really able to express everything that you want to express. I'm going to compare it a little bit to driving like a really nice sports car. You can feel every little bump in some ways, but it feels quite nice, probably nicer than like a Toyota that I grew up with. So for example, if you don't know exactly how to control your bow, we can hear it on a Strad for sure. If your playing style is very much like pressing on an instrument, the Strad might not like it. On other Strads, having too light of a bow might not really get the core of the sound out. There are lots of these little intricacies which make you maybe struggle a little bit on an instrument like a Stradivarius. In the instrument world, we often call about temperament. Some instruments have more of a temper than others. Stradivariuses and a lot of these extremely well-built instruments have many different moods. So the slightest bit of temperature change or humidity change or setup adjustments can completely change the instrument as a whole. This, of course, also applies to some degree to more cost-effective instruments or instruments of different time periods, but particularly for instruments like a Stradivarius. But once you understand what your violin wants and how it plays best, it gives you a range of sound colors and dynamic flexibility and just moods that you cannot find so easily. And that's why, despite having so many great options, a lot of soloists and musicians would still want to play on a Stradivarius violin. Not just because they're magically better for that sense, but because they give you more options in how you want to express yourself. So I think we're ready for a final takeaway. Should we obsess over wanting to play a Stradivarius one day? And honestly, I would personally say obsessing over this might not be the best approach, so no. While Strads are incredible and extremely unique and rare and special, they really are special, the violin and instrument world has changed. There are modern violins that can convey a very similar high quality of sound, power of sound, and colors. And sometimes they're even a bit easier to play. What matters the most is that you find an instrument that works well for you. That being said, if you ever get a chance to try one, do it. It might very much be an experience that you will not forget. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a chance to play on a Strad or hear a Strad being performed? What do you think about these myths? Are Strads really worth the hype, or is it a little too much? Before you click out, don't forget to like this video and leave your opinions down in the comment section. I'd love to get a discussion started. Don't forget to subscribe to Tone-Based Violin for more deep dives into the violin world. So, see you next time. Bye!